One of the claims of the new atheism is that religion in general and Christianity in particular has a tremendously negative effect upon society. Christopher Hitchens has said about religion that religion poisons everything. Well, this past week I read a very interesting review of a book by Arthur Brooks called Who Really Cares? America's Charity Divide, Who Gives, Who Doesn't, and Why It Matters. This review appeared in Books and Culture by John Shields, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado. And I wanted to share it with you because I thought it was very revealing. He says the belief that religious conservatives are less charitable and more hard-hearted than secular liberals has seemed so obviously true as to require little empirical investigation. But, he says, Arthur Brooks's Who Really Cares has a starkly different conclusion. Drawing upon some 10 data sets, Brooks finds that religiosity is among the best predictors of charitable giving. Religious Americans are not only much more likely to give money and volunteer their time to religious and secular institutions, they are also more likely to provide aid to family members, return incorrect change, help a homeless person, and donate blood. In fact, despite expecting to find just the opposite, Brooks concluded, quote, "I have never found a measurable way in which secularists are more charitable than religious people," end quote. He says, consider some examples. Religious citizens who make $49,000 a year gave away about 3.5 times as much money as secular citizens with the same income. They also volunteered twice as often, are 57% more likely to help homeless persons, and 2/3 more likely to give blood at their workplace. He says, yet even these findings tend to obscure the impact of religion upon charity. Even this isn't the full story. He says this is because some of the survey respondents that Brooks classified as secular are indirectly affected by religion if they were raised in a religious household. Consider 2 secular Americans, identical in education, income, and other such measures, but one of whom was raised in a religious household. The secular citizen with a religious upbringing is nearly twice as likely to give to charity. Isn't that remarkable? He says because religious and secular citizens tend to cluster in different communities, some parts of the country are more charitable than others. For instance, Arkansas, where citizens give away some 3.9% of their income, is among the most charitable states, while Massachusetts, where citizens give away 1.8% of their income, is one of the least charitable. Likewise, the citizens of South Dakota give away 75% more of their household income than those in San Francisco. So very interesting contrast in demographics. Brooks ultimately concludes, he says, that the contrasts between conservatives and liberals are large enough that they tend to be part of different cultures or nations, one charitable and one uncharitable. In the uncharitable nation reside some 75 million Americans who never donate their money and 130 million who never volunteer their time. Meanwhile, Americans who give both time and money tend to give a lot of both. Thus, Brooks concludes that there is a, quote, very bright line between what he calls charitable America and selfish America. So there really are 2 Americas, only the dividing line isn't where you might think that it would be. Now here's the downside. Brooks finds that there is nothing distinctive about evangelicals. Thus, religious evangelicals are no more charitable than religious Catholics or Jews. He says, secondly, it's also not clear that contributions in the order of 3 to 6% of one's annual income each year can sustain the larger cultural claims that Brooks makes. Thus, religious citizens may give a good deal more than secular Americans, everything else being equal, but they nonetheless make relatively small contributions from their incomes, that is to say, 3 to 6%, not exactly sacrificial giving. But he says, however you interpret these findings, one conclusion is indisputable. Religious conservatives not only bear little resemblance to the stereotypes that liberal elites ascribe to them, but they also compare favorably to other Americans. In fact, he says other studies, such as Brad Wilcox's, have shown that evangelical men are more engaged with and attentive to their wives and children than mainline and especially secular men. Many other scholars, including Christian Smith, Clyde Wilcox, and Mark Roselle, have found that evangelicals are far more open to pluralistic values than most elites ever imagine. In fact, he says, in my own work, I have come to conclude that Christian activists often behave in much more civil ways than secular activists. So he concludes, with rare exceptions, a growing mountain of research has done little to alter elite opinion, especially in the academy. This is partly because it is simply being ignored. Despite Brooks's original data analysis and provocative thesis, his book has received almost no attention from left-of-center periodicals or radio shows. As of this writing, one exception is a review by Stanley Katz in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which dismisses Brooks's book in one paragraph without engaging his empirical findings. Of course, he says, dogmas are often immune to empirical research, but if secular elites continue to cling to their stereotypes of evangelicals and ignore social science, then they will embrace the very intolerance and anti-intellectualism that they accuse religious believers of possessing. To be so uncharitable toward millions of decent Americans would also be a sad vindication of Brooks's argument. So I thought that was just a remarkable study. There is a mountain, apparently, of empirical evidence that religious belief contributes to generosity, civility, care for the family, and so forth, but this is largely being ignored by the secular elites because they're just impervious to the evidence. With respect to what Brooks found and others have found with regard to evangelical giving, I do think that is an indictment on us that we give so relatively little of our income. Americans are so wealthy. I would challenge you that we ought, many of us, to be thinking about giving 25% or 30% of our income away to the Lord's work and charitable giving. We could live on much, much less than we do by adopting simpler lifestyles. So let that be a challenge to us as well, to really lay up treasures in heaven rather than treasures on earth, and to serve the Lord with our substance.